My name is Josh Campbell. I'm the CEO of Techonomy Media. I'm really excited to have all of you here. We launched, sort of a CDX and a Techonomy video series now about 3 months ago, as soon as we went into sheltering in place, and have continued to bring together these great conversations on Wednesday afternoons at 2 o'clock and Friday mornings at 11. We'll tell you a little more about our Friday session at the end of this session. But this one is so important. I think as we're all thinking about our organizations, these new work models, it's something that we're all addressing. We're all sort of seeing peak productivity now turning into burnout, but really a conversation that's important to have. So excited to have David Rogers and Juliana Nunez with us. I'll turn it over to Drew Ianni, the founder and chairman of CDX, to moderate the conversation.
Super. Thanks, Josh. And thanks everyone who's out there attending, and to our panelists and esteemed guests here. Before we jump in, we'll just quickly review the polls, as I like to do. First of all, great participation rate. I wish we voted like this in the country. 72% of you have voted. I'm not going to read everything to you. You guys can all see it here, but pretty interesting, pretty split evenly in terms of next 90 days before the end of the year. In terms of coming back, 20% planning to be remote permanently. Personal preference. I think this is maybe, about what I thought it would be. 80% like the flexibility, and I think we're going to see that hybrid model work, moving forward. We may talk a little bit about that today. Productivity, really interesting. Initially more productive, now becoming burnt out, 13% of you. I think that's interesting. And evenly split between yes, no, and I'm not sure about engaging in fundamental organizational redesign. Well, hopefully we can help you all accelerate that internally. And about what I expected in the mix between HR being a mission critical strategic function. Of course it should be, and hopefully we'll talk about that today as well. So thank you for participating in the poll, and thank you for joining us. So let's get rolling here. We have a big crew today, so we're going to jump right in, and I'm going to do very, very brief introductions with everybody, and then we're going to get a little deeper with everybody here as well. I'm first going to introduce my good friend and a longtime industry colleague, Matt Quint. Matt, why don't you take it away, introduce yourself, and then we'll go down the line, David, and then Juliana. Matt, you might need to unmute yourself.
Oh, I got it. Yeah. Thank you, Josh. got the button before I even got there. Wonderful back end. So thank you, Drew. Pleasure to be on here. Interesting doing remote. Last time we worked on something together was the CDX blockchain conference back 18 months ago or so. So it seems like a long time ago. For those who are not aware, I'm the director of the Center on Global Brand Leadership at Columbia Business School. And the center creates, gathers, and shares information on what it takes to build and maintain a strong brand. So we do that through teaching, through running events, and through research and special groups and outreach. So it's a pleasure to be putting this on with you, and I will pass it off to my friend and colleague, David.
Hi, my name's David Rogers. Happy to join this discussion today. I teach at Columbia Business School. I'm full-time faculty in our executive education division, so I get the pleasure of teaching executives from all over the world in every industry, typically somewhere in the midpoint of their career as they're preparing to move on to new leadership challenges or new areas of personal and organizational growth. My personal focus and my specialty, both my teaching and my writing and my advising and working with companies and consulting, is around digital transformation. Who's next? Juliana?
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Juliana Nunez, and I'm the head of human resources for the technology team at Johnson & Johnson. It's an honor to be here, and I'm also a former student of David Rogers. I see a lot of current and former students here, so you have a lot of fellowships for sure, Dave. And I'm very passionate about, technology and the role that it has in all the different aspects of our organization. So thanks for the invite, Drew. It's really an honor to be here.
Great, thank you so much for all of you for being here. So David, why don't you tell us a little bit about some of your past writings? Certainly the digital transformation playbook here at CDX. We focus almost entirely on digital transformation, and then one of the reasons we all wanted to chat with you today because you do have a new book coming out looking at organizational redesign. So set us up here and tee the conversation up for us today. Thank you.
Terrific. Well, thank you again, Drew and Matt, for the invitation to be here to speak to the audience. So my work, as I said, has focused on digital transformation, really looking at the impact of emerging technologies, and more importantly, the adoption of technologies by individuals and systems, both sort of behavioral level and sort of systemic level, and how that is shaping organizations. And so several years ago, I started trying to sort of put together some of my latest research and thinking about this and really trying to understand what kind of change organizations were facing. And I wrote a book called The Digital Transformation Playbook. And at the time, that was the first book published on the topic. And as my publisher happily pointed out to me, I had demonstrated the difference between writing a book that you're proud of, which would have been my first 3 books, and a book that you're proud of how it turned out, and also the timing is right for the market. So the book came out just as that sort of issue really started to hit on the agenda for companies. So it's out in 9 languages. If you're looking for one other than English, hopefully you'll find it. Japanese is coming out at the end of the year. That'll be 10. And it's kept me very busy since then, as I said, with my teaching, as well as traveling, speaking to and advising and talking to companies and leaders in all sorts of industries around the world. And so what's interesting, what sort of changed between when I wrote that book and today, is when I wrote that book, we were just starting to sort of recognize that digital was not simply a challenge for something like marketing. Right? A lot of people said that was the early sort of narrow assumption. It's not a tactical challenge. It's not a technology challenge. It's not a particular function, but it was something about the whole organization was going to be impacted. And so by now, everyone at least gives lip service to digital transformation, right? And most organizations feel that they are attempting some kind of a digital transformation. Most sort of surveys of major organizations. And yet the large majority of those express frustration. And so you see a lot of these reports and studies, why are digital transformations failing? 70% failure rate, or however you want to call it. I'm not sure failure is really the right characterization, but clearly most organizations, many organizations, feel they are attempting to make a change, and yet they're not seeing the traction, the impact, the results that they were anticipating. And so that's a pretty broad, important, and I would argue urgent question. And I think if we want to understand where this gap is coming from, we have to start with understanding what do we actually mean by digital transformation. And as I laid out in the book, digital transformation to me is simply this. It is how an organization, any organization that was started before the digital era, before the internet, how those organizations must change, adapt, and evolve in order to continue to grow and thrive in the digital age. So this is specifically, it is not about a startup. It's a related but different question from how do you build a new business from scratch today? Look for a white space opportunity, some new combination of business model, consumer behavior, and create, the classic Steve Blank's formula, a repeatable, scalable, profitable business model. It is a different challenge if you have an existing organization, because in addition to those strategic and market-oriented and customer-centric questions you have to face, you have these additional challenges of how do you actually change this existing organization? How do you turn the ship, so to speak? How do you overcome the inertia? How do you both take advantage of the real strengths that you have, the benefits you have, the assets and skills and capabilities and customer base and all these things you have as an existing business and brand relative to a startup, but how do you also escape the sort of traps that can come from being already established in this sort of previous model built for a previous era that simply was probably good for then. That's why you're around today as a legacy business, but is not going to get you where you need to go tomorrow. So that's my definition of digital transformation. How do these organizations adapt? And that points to one sort of foundational insight, which I wrote about at the beginning of the last book, which is that we have to recognize digital transformation is fundamentally not about technology. This is probably the most common myth among many about digital transformation. You are responding in part certainly in response to events and externalities that have been catalyzed by technologies. Any strategy you develop, the implementation will of course involve technology. So technology is not at all irrelevant, but it is not the key. It is not the heart. The most difficult and the most central part of digital transformation is not actually about the technology. And what I've learned through my writing, my research, and through working over the years with companies is that really digital transformation is about three things. It's about strategy, it's about organizational process, and it's about culture. And my last book looked at all of those, but it looked primarily at strategy. And so the overarching sort of design and structure of it is a framework which sort of puts strategy first, is sort of the way, how do you understand, rethink your strategic assumptions. It's really about sort of rewriting your playbook for strategy in relation to customers, in relation to competition, understanding who we compete with and how, and the dynamics, business model, value proposition, innovation process, data, etc. This book, the book that I'm writing this year, which is going to come out in 2021, is meant to be a complement to that, not just a sequel, but sort of the other piece that should interlock with it. And so it focuses primarily on process and culture, connecting it back to strategy, but showing how do you bring these pieces, how do you really make those work, and particularly how do you make those work at scale? And this is where I found the challenge. I've met mid-sized businesses who've read my last book and they say, great, I got it, I understand. I now have tools to rethink my strategy, to reconceive who my customers are, how to create value for them, who do I compete with and how competition is no longer black and white, all these things. Great, go out and do it. But if you are a business that is thousands of people, that may have a company with multiple lines of business, perhaps even in different industries, operating in different geographies, the organizational barriers of process and culture are so big that they can simply cripple your efforts. And this is what I think of, what I observe as the phenomenon of the stymied CEO. So I see, and I have spoken to so many organizations where the leadership gets it in the sense they believe, yes, I see the world has changed. Yes, I understand the strengths and the way we grew in the past is not how we're going to grow in the future. Yes, I'm committed to a digital future for this business. I'm putting money behind it. I'm allocating budgets. I'm telling everyone in the organization this is a big priority. I'm talking about it all the time. I thought that's what I'm supposed to do as a CEO. Now, why do I see nothing happening? Or why is everything moving so slowly? And they're frustrated. They say a year has gone by, 2 years have gone by, and everything is just kind of inching along, right? And what I always ask in those questions is, what are people measured on in their work in your company? How are resources allocated? What is your governance model? How are projects chosen, selected, sponsored, evaluated, run? How are people recognized and compensated? If you have not changed the operating model of your organization, you're still using the same process to define work, measure work, organize, allocate funds, budget, do all of these things that make an organization run at scale, right? Because you can't run like a flat, startup when you're thousands of people around the world. If you have not really delved into and dug into and rebuilt those elements, then even if you have the right mandate and urgency and dollars behind it, and even have a strategic direction, you are not going to see nearly the level of results that you will otherwise. So that's why I'm focusing this book that I'm writing now. And it's, my goal is, process and culture are, even more so culture, very slippery terms and topics. It's easy to sort of talk in circles around them without really getting a lot of clarity, I find. So I'm really devoting myself in this book to trying to approach these two pillars in a very rigorous way, with specific frameworks, with case studies from very different industries to illustrate how this plays out, not just in one kind of company, and with hopefully some pretty useful planning tools to help you sort of apply these steps and measures in your own organization for its own unique context, because the road ahead is going to be different for every single organization.
That's great. Thanks for that, David. And So I'm thinking just, sort of a bit on the fly here and thinking about your next book. And then we just did these poll questions, right? About, people and what they want to do in terms of where they go to work and remote. Has the experience of the last 90 to 120 days in terms of shifting how we work, has that in any way sort of altered your view about this next book? And if you're going to try to upgrade culture, and culture is sort of distributed, just any inklings there. And we didn't really talk about this before, but that came to me as you were talking.
Yeah. No, every conversation we're having today, I mean, these days, as the big COVID question for us comes in. So, the thing about writing a book is, it's pretty unusual for the way we live our lives in the digital era, because it's very slow. It's a long-term process. I mean, it's great. One of the things really effective leaders talk about is long-term thinking. And there's nothing to push you into long-term thinking like writing a book as opposed to an article or blog post or something. Because anything you write, you have to assume will be read by someone you don't know in a context you can't predict years from now. Because it takes that long to write and then produce and then publish. And even then, people were buying my last book today for the first time, which it's meant to be. And so the challenge of that, of course, the slow process is when a huge sort of external event like COVID happens, your immediate response as an author is panic. You're like, oh my God, will this make my book I've been working on for X many, months or years, suddenly, ill-timed, not like perfect timing, but the opposite. It's like the one thing nobody's thinking about. And of course that panic sort of quickly subsided as I started to see more and more indicators that broadly speaking, people see digital transformation as more urgent in the light of the COVID crisis than before. I was listening to Kristalina Georgieva. She's the managing director of the IMF. She was giving a talk recently for the Washington Post, and she said, digital is the big winner of this crisis, was her way of saying it. And in fact, she said, from their point of view, from a policy point of view, that was one of their 3 top priorities, they said, in terms of trying to drive positive change and outcomes coming out of this crisis. Was one of them was trying to expand digital transformation to include more economies, more sectors, more sort of stakeholders. So I think it's clear the reason why. I mean, companies are all being pushed to greater agility and flexibility, which is at the core of what I'm writing about in this book. Everyone, if they weren't already there, is being pushed to more non-physical delivery models, sort of physical or face-to-face only when necessary rather than by default. Everyone, no matter what your business, is being pushed to non-physical or digital by default operating models. I mean, how do we work, whether it's literally, whether you're a very human capital intensive services firm or whether you're dealing with a supply chain if you're manufacturing. And then of course, we've got cost pressures, which are going to push us towards business model innovation, which is a lot of what's at the heart of digital transformation. And of course, the centrality of data, of both what we're grappling with right now, the massive uncertainty, trying to deal with that, all the solutions we're looking at related to COVID, data is central to all of them. But so basically, the sigh of relief was that this has simply sort of elevated the importance, and not just sort of in the moment, but sort of a greater recognition of sort of inescapability. That, as I say, in the first chapter in the book, digital transformation is not optional. Right. It's not something. It's not an if. It's a how.
And speaking of chapters, we will be offering everyone attending today a complimentary chapter from the Digital Transformation book. I'll put that link in chat string a little bit later on. So looking forward to that.
Thank you, Drew.
Real quickly before I go to Juliana, David, I had heard someone say, when you were talking about strategy and its customers and its data and all that, and the rest of it is the company's operating system. And these companies have just not had their operating systems upgraded in a long, long time. But well, let's get to a company that's actually doing this. Juliana, it's great to have you here. And why don't you just give us a tiny bit quickly of some background about your role there and the group that you're in, and then what's top of mind. I know Agile's top of mind, and a lot is top of mind, particularly with work culture being transformed. But introduce yourself, and then what's top of mind for you right now?
Sure, absolutely. As I mentioned, resources are the technology organization, which involves 5,000 people around the globe, plus, J&J employees, plus, all other people that are part of our ecosystem as well. And we have several of my team members here attending the webinar, so that is also awesome to see. For me, what is top of mind is how can we take advantage of this whole COVID pandemic, as Dave was saying, where people are much more open to embrace technology to really accelerate the pace of digital transformation at J&J. So everybody's talking about digital transformation. We have been talking that, for a long time, but it's great to see that now people have no options. So things that we were trying to do in the past and we needed to convince people, now they come to us and say, hey, how can we move that faster? And Dave mentioned that transformation is not just, digital transformation is not just about, adopting new and modern technologies, but most importantly, and for me in HR, it plays a huge role, is how you create the environment where people can bring their best, their natural best to life. How can they really leverage the potential of all those technologies? And what are the skill sets that we're going to need in this new organization? There are a lot of things that we call their legacy skill sets. And then honestly, maybe we don't need to have human beings doing anymore. We can have bots doing. And that's what we are talking at J&J as well. We have, bots as part of our workforce. And it's very interesting to see that for the first time. But, I mentioned about Agile, and I truly believe that Agile ways of working is a critical enabler for digital transformation. So we started this journey at J&J in one of our divisions, that is the consumer division, more intense 1 year ago, but in some places, 2 years ago. And that was the first time that we were bringing that outside of the technology organization, because it's easier for you to do it because, Agile, it started with Agile Manifesto that it was created for software development. So for the tech team, it's easier for them to apply those those principles. But for the commercial organization, is really hard. And we really believed that was what we needed in order to accelerate the pace of this transformation. So actually, we start this process in EMEA, and because I think one of the things that are really important in this whole process is making sure that you have the leadership really supporting you. And certainly we had also because they had no choice. The business was really suffering for years. And he said, I need to try something new. And, we really start thinking about, how do we translate those principles in a way that the commercial organization, the marketing, the sales team, they can really understand what we're talking about. So we create some principles that help that, because for me, Agile is really the mindset shifted that you needed to promote. And, but they said also that it's the whole ecosystem that you needed to create. So we needed to, establish we established the squads that is small. We call it the small pizza team, where you have end-to-end representation. So everybody that is, a product or a service or a consumer, for instance, they are there sitting together and they use the Agile principles. They start, stand-up meetings and everything that we talk about, Kanbans and retrospective, really to accelerate this process. So we create those teams, we create a new process, we put together, a new governance as well. And then, people could see the benefit of doing that. And I think in EMEA now they train more than 6,000 people. And then with the results that we had there, we started, bringing to other parts of the organization. We went to Asia, we went to Brazil, and now other parts of J&J is also very interested in see how can we bring that to life. But there was one question here to the panelists, what does it mean, this whole digital conversation in terms of org design? It's because for me, you cannot keep the org design that we have today if you really want to create an environment where people can not just move faster, because Agile is not moving faster. And I have one of my says that Agile is about reducing waste, because you're working small pieces and you are delivering the MVPs and you're getting the feedback of your consumer faster. So I think in order to do that, you cannot have the setup with the departments and the silos that we have today. So that's what we are trying to do at J&J, but it's a journey. It's not that we are like an experts. We are learning as we go.
And Juliana, so you had talked about, when you first start sort of this exercise, right? And you develop squads. And to me, Agile is sort of like Six Sigma. It's a philosophy. It's a religion. It's so vast in its sort of scope. So really tactical, sort of in the weeds question here. When you started, how did you start? I mean, so let's say you got the squads now, but what did you do? Were you communicating to all employees in that consumer sector that this is coming, that, hey, we've got this sort of, what literally were your first things that you did tactically to sort of kick off that transformation?
So actually, the way that it started is because there is one of the directors based in Germany that he was responsible for a very small brand called Skin Health brand, and he decided to apply on his own team. So he created squads. He included in this squad people that were not used to be working together. So you had supply chain, you had marketing, you would have a digital person, everybody sitting together. And guess what? They were able to deliver results faster than anybody else. And I think they were able to do that also because they were not one of the big J&J brands. So people were not really, paying attention to what they were doing. But when the results started to come, they said, oh my God, what you were doing, So they were very interested to understand what they were doing there. And that's how things started. At the same time, we have another experiment in the US where it was more top down in terms of, hey, let's create squads. They created 10 squads and, but I used this experience with the team in Europe because I felt that they were actually entrepreneur and much more end-to-end, and they were not doing that to show the organization. They were just trying to figure out a way of doing things better and faster. So with those results, that was easier for us to say, hey, what we are trying to do is try a new way of doing things and look to Bebe and look to the results that they had. And people were very interesting to learn. And also now everybody's talking about agile in the media. So, I think it helps also that people are more open to understand what we're talking about, what we are trying to do. But it's not easy. Like we have a small group of people that are very passionate about that. We travel around the world, to share our experience. And, it's really a cultural change. When you are at J&J, we are very used to, we needed to be perfect. So just go when you're perfect, when you're ready. And agile is the opposite. Don't wait for you to be perfect, go faster. So what is your MVP? Go, let's experiment. And if it's not working, let's pivot. It's not the way that we traditional did things at J&J. So it's a big change for us.
And staying in the weeds, just a quick follow-up, and then I know Matt has a question. So, when you get these squads together and you're kicking it off and you're putting these teams together, people that aren't used to being together, is there what has worked best in terms of like a first assignment? Is it like a product redesign? And that is really good because it does bring all these sort of disciplines together. In terms of actually, getting the ship off the dock, what are these squads doing, right? Where is it easiest to sort of start this change? Is it a product redesign exercise like might happen in one of the, corporate labs? Is it, I hope my question is clear, but, what type of an assignment or a task works best to start this process with a team?
I don't know. I wouldn't say that that you needed to have a specific task where it would work better. I think it works better where people are really open to try that, So when, when we started the experiment 2-3 years ago in the US, we saw that some squads, so we created squads, some squads were really open to embrace this whole process. And that you saw different results compared to others that were saying, now we are agile, but they were really, leaving the traditional waterfall approach. So for me, it's really like, are people truly open to try new things? Because it's not easy, So for a leader, when you establish these squads, you needed to truly empower these squads to make decisions, which means that you are no longer under control. You don't know exactly what every single person in your team is doing. I remember this leader in Germany. He said, hey, I use it to be with my team every day. And then suddenly I decided to be once a month, because if I was there every day, I would be still in control. And I really want them to figure out their own space. So I think that's for me the most important thing. Where is your organization in terms of embracing this than anything else?
That's great. Matt, before I go to you real quick, David, I just want you to your follow-up thought to that in regards to the digital transformation playbook. What's the first play you call, in the organization? How do you get it moving? Whether it's just something small and focused, but sort of the same question to you. I'm going to unmute you as well. There we go.
Whoops.
Go for it.
Clicking too fast. Sorry about that. Thanks, Drew. And let me actually piggyback on a couple points Juliana just made. I absolutely agree that, one of the most important things is looking for who is most ready. I think that sort of human level question is probably more important than, division, silo, project, geography. I mean, I think it's a telling example that, as Juliana pointed to, one of the early, really sort of organic, strong sort of learnings came out of a small brand, in a large organization. That's great. You've got the almost anonymity. People are looking at you to generally try something different. But, it points to two things. One is they had a very clear need, right? The urgency was clear for them. I talk in my writing in the next book about the importance of dual urgency, having positive and negative urgency if possible. So they had a burning platform. They had a declining brand. They felt they weren't getting the results that they wanted. So they had that urgency there. They didn't have to be convinced. They said, yeah, we've got to try something different. This isn't working. The other thing is that it was a small organization. That not only means sort of you maybe have less people watching you, it also means you're used to operating as a somewhat flatter organization. Right? If you're a small brand, so I direct something with, we have a collaboration ongoing for several years between Google and Columbia Business School called the CMO Academy, which I co-direct with Google. And, looking back, it's not surprising that that idea was pitched to me by Google. And it actually came out of a small division of Google. It came out of this woman in Canada, in their Toronto office, which as far as like the Americas goes, is not one of their big offices. But she was both thinking she didn't need to ask, permission, or wasn't sort of, it's like, make decisions, go call up Columbia Business School. And second, she could get it started. Once we sort of put the plan together and she got the green light, she said, it's good we're doing this. If it goes well, America's going to take it over. But, California or New York would be talking about this for 3 years before they would get it off the ground with Columbia. And we had it off the ground in a few months. So, parts of the organization that are used to operating in a flat fashion are going to do that. And that's the last point. That points to one of the really critical things. And this is part of Agile, and it's part of something Juliana was talking about earlier with me, is, one of the key culture changes that has to happen, and I've identified 7 of them that are sort of the most sort of common or central sort of changes that have to happen in culture, typically between a sort of a pre-digital business and becoming a truly digitally oriented one. And one of those is becoming more bottom-up as an organization. That's both the flow of information, those are the people who are touching the customer, and this is the hard part, decision-making. Can you push down decisions to the lowest level of the organizational chart? In Amazon, they call it the lowest leaf node of the org chart. And that's what Agile is about. I mean, actually, all of these principles come from a few different streams of thought, which are really the most influential management theories of the last decade. And they don't necessarily make it in the pages of HBR, but it's Agile software development, lean startup, design thinking, and product management. And those 4 are, in a way, 4 different ways of talking about the exact same core ideas. They just come from different places. I call them the 4 religions of innovation in the digital era. And they each have their practitioners, and they have their rituals and their rites and the incense they swing around. But they're all really striving towards the same fundamental ideas. And exactly some of the things Juliana talked about shipping now, pivoting, getting in front of the customer as soon as possible, rapidly testing and learning and iterating, not waiting till it is perfect. Everything becomes iterative rather than sequential. That's the sort of fundamental sequence of Agile software development. It's fundamental lean startup. It's fundamental to design thinking. So all of these have these sort of same core cultural principles at heart. And one of the hardest culturally is that bottom up, that shift, because as Juliana exactly put her finger on, in a legacy organization, right? Because most of these processes came out of small teams. Lean startup was not developed for large organizations, it was developed for small teams. But in a large organization, that means somebody is giving up what used to be their control, what used to define them as a leader. And they are now saying, I'm not going to be watching what the team under me is doing. I'm not going to be making the decisions about what that team does. They're going to make the decisions. I may agree with them. I mean, typically what you do, for example, at Amazon, you charter the team. The team has to define up front, how are we going to define success? What's our goals? What's our metrics? Those have to be signed off on. You have to come to an agreement. But then how you achieve that outcome, how you achieve those goals is totally up to the team. So all of a sudden you're pushing down what used to be management to people below you. And so that is, depending on your prior experience and your psychology, sort of emasculating or terrifying, or sort of you feel like you've been demoted, or you feel like, thank goodness, I can now be the kind of leader I want to be. You know, there's a saying in companies like Netflix that great leaders make as few decisions as possible. Right? Our leaders strive to make as few decisions as possible. The leader is no longer the decision maker. So it's a real big shift in how leadership operates within an organization.
Interesting. Yeah, I'd love to explore that deeper. Matt, I know you have a question for Juliana. There you go.
Thank you, Drew. Hopefully, yes, not getting an echo this time around, it seems. No, I am getting an echo. Can you nod your heads? Are you hearing that too?
A little bit.
No,
There we go.
Not much.
Okay.
Definitely
okay.
Now
less.
it's gone away.
Yeah.
Now it's gone away.
Yeah.
Thank you all. Sorry about that. So my question kind of got answered in some ways by the way you asked something to Juliana. I was bringing up something one of our management faculty talked about with a course on management he was teaching to the MBAs, and this shift to sort of also what David was talking about, more bottom up. There was even a question in the chat about, you know, hierarchy versus holacracy and the way these things, and the management professor expected these MBA students to be so excited by the idea that they would go into business and have much more decision-making authority, et cetera. And he found the exact opposite. And maybe it was particularly unique to maybe a expensive MBA education where they were wary of that. And that's kind of what Juliana talked about a little bit was, right, it's working well in some teams, it's not in others, which gets into how do you do this culture. So I thought that was really interesting. So what I would pass off to, given the time we're at, and what I know people are always interested in, and has come up in the chat, and we had talked about ourselves, are, right, the KPIs and the measurements beyond this. And maybe we can start with David on that broad perspective for the book, and then slide into Juliana to also talk about where are they kind of looking at what are some success measures, and I think ideally both for, you know, the teams in doing this, but also for leadership to be able to get the buy-in that this is really working. David, why don't you start off?
All right. So to me, you know, I'm not a big believer in management by objective. An idea that sounded good in theory when Peter Drucker proposed it, and he himself decades later had to disavow it, seeing how it had been applied in practice. When I think about measurement, I look more to approaches like OKRs, which came out of Intel and Andy Grove, and it's been evangelized by people like John Doerr. The thing about a method like OKRs to think about measurement is actually there's two sides. OKRs defines it, it's just one approach, as the objective versus the key results. Objective is not really how we used to talk about objectives in the Peter Drucker sense, or the sort of post-Peter Drucker MBO sense, where the objective was some kind of business outcome. We will sell X many things, we will gain this market share, we'll do, you know, hit some kind of numbers, and then those sort of trickle down. So you've got this top level sort of performance metric, and then you've got another metric that trickles down that has to support that, and that pushes down. So you have this sort of cascading down of these metrics people are held accountable to. And then worst of all, it's tied to their compensation, promotions, and rewards, which sounds very logical, but turns out to be actually very ineffective. There's lots of management research to show that. Instead, with an approach like OKRs, the objective side is about what are you shooting for? And that can actually be qualitative. It's more of like your mission, what are the big goals that you kind of know when you'll reach them, but it's something that's much bigger and broader than something you can sort of put a number on for the quarter. And then the quantitative metrics, the key results in that approach, are measures that show you're making progress towards that. So you say, if this is a big goal, what do we think is going to help us achieve that? Well, here's 3 things I think we could try to do in the next quarter, and how I would define that we've made the progress I think would be kind of an ambitious stretch. And I think if we manage to hit all of those, we'll definitely be closer to that goal. So the point here about measurement is there is a role for quantitative measurement and metrics, but you have to begin with the other side, which is more alignment about the goal itself, alignment about the strategy, what you're trying to achieve. And that carries over in my view on leadership, in my view on alignment, which I talk about, in my writing today, and even the whole sort of framework in the next book. The job of leaders really today, what does the leader do, right? If you no longer are making the decisions, you're no longer the decider in chief, right? That's not your job title anymore. And to me, when you have a bottom-up organization, the leader has to do 4 things. They have to define, communicate, enable, and embody the change that they want to see in their organization. So really what I'm talking about in terms of objectives and measurements is spending more time on the defining a culture and maybe the changes you're trying to make in the culture. What does that mean to become, for example, in J&J's case, we're trying to become more agile. Well, how do we have to change? Do we have to become more customer centric? Do we have to become more iterative and do we have to become more data driven? What are the changes we have to make in our culture? Defining that sort of guiding mission or goal for the organization, that's actually the first step in the framework that I'm working on right now, is not saying we are going to have a digital transformation, but getting much more specific and saying, why does digital matter, not even just to our industry in particular, but to our organization in particular? What is our goal, our ambition? And it has to be unique to your organization, your history, your context, the value you create for the world. And then defining, again, for the leader, the strategy, which really means what are you going to prioritize? What are the most important things? Because there's always more opportunities you could pursue than you'll have time and place. So to me, I always think it is much more important to spend more time, and what I see companies spend way too little time is on defining where you're going, and then they rush to measure it. And I find the companies that do best err on the exact opposite. They spend much more time defining where they're going, communicating that relentlessly and thematically, stories, shareholder letters like Jeff Bezos, gossip calls like my friend Ben Salzman in the insurance industry, never stopping, over and over and over. Enabling, right? This is the idea of servant leadership, is that leaders' job is not to tell you what to do, it's to remove obstacles. It's to give you the skills or the tools or the resources you need as the team, clear things out of the way, and then embody that change yourself. And that really, as a leader, is mostly about resource allocation. It's about talent. Who do you find? Who do you hire? Who do you retain? Who do you shove out the door and say, I'm sorry, you just are not aligned with our vision and our culture, where we're going. You got to actually walk the walk and be willing to sacrifice things, like star players in your company who are driving lots of money and say, you do not align with where we're going. That's a key characteristic of real leaders today. And then helping those who you do attract and retain, helping them grow, giving them the development, the skills, the tools, and so forth. And so it's really that, it's allocating resources, it's putting your money and your head count. In Silicon Valley, they always say leaders vote with head count, because there's not a shortage of cash in companies like Google, but there is a shortage of talented engineers. So where do you put your most talented people? So voting with resources, head count, talent, and picking the metrics, and make sure those metrics really do align with that vision, the goal that you set at the beginning. So to me, it's not about measuring everything. It's not measuring on a scale, how customer centric are we this month versus last month. It's about defining what we're actually trying to achieve as a company, and figuring out in a very, again, agile, iterative way, those metrics, those quantitative metrics should be revisited and reviewed every single quarter at a minimum. Are we getting closer to that goal?
Right. And I see Matt frozen, so I'm just going to take here and Juliana, follow up with you with the same sort of question here, just in regards to, metrics. Have you established metrics, or, how do you know it's working? The best way for me to ask. And then is there formal measurement behind that?
I think I can tell you what we are trying to do, what we are doing. And again, I'm not, my intent is not to be perfect because we are learning as we go. But I think ultimately we want to see Agile translating into business outcomes. And again, coming back to EMEA, to the European organization, if we were not seeing a shift on the business results, we wouldn't have credibility to go to other parts of the organization. So the US team, who started that before, and they thought that they were in a very good place, when they saw what EMEA was doing and the results on the business, they would say, okay, maybe we have something to learn there. So ultimately, that's what we want to do. But I know there are other factors that also impact business results. So we were like, how can we really be more specific in terms of seeing the impact of what we are doing with Agile? So for us, and we're still trying to refine and figure that out. But one thing that we do is we established 3 laws that we said, that translate what does Agile means for J&J. So one is around consumer and customer centricity. The second is around servant leadership. And the third one is empower teams. And we define the principles for each one of the laws. So what we do when we go to a country is we do a survey with, the leadership team and the leaders who report to this leadership team, where they assess themselves against these 3 principles. So we have the baseline, and then we can track that. We do this survey every 6 months, so we can track the progress against those three principles. So it's more qualitative, but at least it gives us a sense where we are. And it's very interesting because during the kickoff week, we also show the results and say, hey, leadership team, that's where you see yourself. And that's where, the whole organization see that, how you're doing. So that is something that we are doing. The other thing to try to be more pragmatic as well. And again, we are not tracking number of people we track, but the most important thing is not, we have 6,000 people trained, because we know that this is checking the process and we are really trying to see the outcomes. So what we are trying to do as well is, for instance, if I take customer centricity as the first one, how can we see that we are becoming much more focused on the consumer and the customer and not internally focused? And, in organizations like J&J, it's very easy for you to spend the whole time just in internal meetings discussing, internal process. So one thing that we try to see is, can we leverage technology like Microsoft Analytics, that for those who use Microsoft Analytics, you receive a weekly snapshot of your calendar, and it demonstrates how you're spending your time. So we were, our question was, okay, can I see if there is a shift between the time that people are spending internally in meetings and the time they are spending with customers, for instance? So we are in this process of having whole conversations with legal, EMEA, we have GDPR, so there's all these data privacy issues that we're trying to solve. But those are the things that we are trying to, see that can help us, beyond a survey, to really see change on each one of those specific behaviors that I mentioned to you, And also, other things that we're trying to do is, okay, in order to, you launched a product in X amount of months. Now, you can reduce the cycle time by, half. So those kind of things, we are working with the analytics teams and the data scientist team to see, what are the best metrics for us? Because if you don't demonstrate with data that you're really making change, it's another wave. And, and then somebody will come with something that is more popular. That's not what we want. We truly believe that it has impact on their business results, and that's what we want to track.
That's great. So we're going to try to squeeze in a couple questions here before we get to 3. We're going to take up the whole hour here. So Cheryl Root has a question, and Cheryl, normally we go out to audio, but I'm trying to squeeze things in. I'm just going to read your question, and it's for both of you, and Juliana, we'll start with you. And I have a related question to it. Culture is created through behaviors. What are the ways to shift the behaviors effectively? You can't just say, I want this culture. And what I'm going to build on there is sort of taking a step back to organizational redesign or design, right? To effectively transform, Juliana and then David, organizational design, we all want flatter hierarchies. So what do? We have to eliminate layers? Is it, how do you redesign the organizational structure, the org chart? Is that what also has to be redesigned to then instill the proper type of culture? So if you want to take that and then also talk a little bit about culture as well, but when I hear organizational design, I want to be more lean, I want to have less hierarchy. What does that mean in terms of actually redesigning the org structure of the organization? And then how does that drive culture? So Juliana.
Well, at J&J, we are always looking to the number of layers that we have, and definitely, you know, a streamlined organization is always a goal for us. But I think that when you create this squad, there's no layer in the squad because it's really about the network, you know. So there is not one person in the squad, even the squad leader, that is more important than anybody else. So thus, you know, everybody has the same voice, and everybody need to have an end-to-end view of what we are trying to do. So I think for me, the best way for you to really streamline the organization is not doing this big org chains on how many layers we have, how can we reduce the number of layers, is, you know, what is the minimum team that needs to be together to deliver what we needed to deliver for our customers? And as David was saying, how do we push the decision-making down to be closer as possible to this consumer and to these customers? And, you know, if you're truly enabling this organization, I'm pretty sure the results are going to come, and that's going to drive that, you know, change in other parts of the organization as well. You know, in terms of the behavior that you mentioned, a big piece, and I said one of the principles that we define is around servant leadership. And I truly believe that if you don't change the way the leaders are behaving, you know, it's really hard for you to have, you know, a true agile organization. So some of the things that we define that as servant leadership for us should be doing is moving from command control to what we call intent is the new command. So I come and say, hey, that's our vision, and guys, you figured it out, you know. Or we say enabling the future is the new justifying the past. Spend a lot of time looking to numbers to justify the past. The role of the leader is not to justify the past, it's really build capabilities for the future. And instead of being a functional leader, the role of the leader is helping to connect the dots. So those are the kind of things that we are trying to promote. And where people is starting doing that, you see a change on behavior. And then I think other people, you know, will start to as well. I truly believe that, you know, you start small and then you scale as you go, and other people see the benefit of what we are doing.
That's great. David, I'm going to give you the last word on that. And there was a question that came in that's related in terms of scaling this new culture. So if you can also talk about org redesign and culture, and particularly scaling that kind of culture. And then we'll wrap it up and we'll get that chapter of the book out to people as well.
Terrific. Well, fantastic to hear Juliana's comments again. This is, as I said, the real pleasure of the kind of teaching I get to do through Columbia's executive programs is to have students like Juliana in my classes, and then, you know, follow up and reconnect with them a year or two later, like in this case, and see all the great work they're doing. That, you know, you see some of your own ideas put to work, other great ideas you've been following put to work by them, and you learn from your students as much as you know, hopefully help them to learn. So first, I just want to reiterate something Juliana said, which is really, it is not the big org redesign. You know, frankly, that just takes too long. You do not want to be bringing in your McKinsey, BCG, Accenture, like, okay, a year and a half, we're going to reorg this entire global organization. You can't wait. It's like everything else we're talking about. It has to be iterative. So the organizational redesign itself is going to be iterative. It's going to start small with the most urgent, most pressing, most ready case, most ready group of people, and you're going to build it up from there. I completely agree with the idea that it's about making the organizational change also start from bottom up. Yes, overall, you're trying to be more flat, right? There are limits to that. You know, there is no large organization in the world, Google, Amazon, any of them, that is completely flat. That's sort of, I think, the myth of holacracy, which is why I don't like. It's like hierarchy versus no, let's not pick another H. But what it is you can have layers. You know, there are layers in an organization like Amazon, but the two pizza team at the bottom has decision-making power. And that immediately transforms it's no longer hierarchy, even though there are layers, right? So, and that doesn't have to wait for all these redrawing of lines and everything. So it's really about taking an approach that you can start immediately, implement, learn from, build the credibility, have others take from and learn from that. In terms of scaling this, I'll just briefly, the approach I'm developing on this is that, culture, changing culture. Look, if you're a small organization, it's pretty simple. Culture is defined by the founding team and by who you hire, right? And that's really important. Those are two of that and raising money are the three jobs of a founder of a new business, right? It's getting the right people. I guess yourself you've taken care of. So it's hiring the right people and raising money. But as you're a large organization, as you're a big company, and as small companies get bigger, as they pass that magical Dunbar number, they no longer, it doesn't hold together. And so to scale culture, you need two things. One is you need process. You need to embed the culture and process. It's exactly what Juliana was just illustrating. Precisely what I advocate, which is not talking about culture in sort of a vague way, but really defining what are the principles or particularly what are the shifts that are most important. You don't need to spend a lot of time talking about we don't lie to each other and cheat our numbers unless that's been an issue in your organization. Right, yeah, of course that's a core value, but focus on what are you trying to shift? Okay, we're gonna choose pick three. That's wonderful. Pick those three, articulate them, get into the nuance, right? They have to be explicit. They have to be discussed. They have to be nuanced. They should be dialectical, meaning they each sort of argue a little bit against each other. So nothing is black and white. You get that articulation. What are we actually pushing for? And the thing is, then you're ready to embed that in process. And once you know what those three things, those five things, whatever those shifts are that you're trying to make, process is how you codify culture at scale. And so that's how you say things like, okay, this is the composition of the team. The team can be no larger than this. The famous memo from Bezos in 2002, all teams must make their data and their processes open and accessible to everyone else in the organization. That was a process change. It's organizations who say, we're going to bring in a new tool so that everyone in the organization, in a very traditional B2B industrial company that creates canisters of gas to go to factories, guess what? Everyone there is going to have customer feedback at their fingertips. We are going to be as customer centric as Apple because we're going to create a process where we're feeding in and drawing that data in from the customer in real time and pushing it to every single person in the organization. So taking steps like that, making, whether it's becoming more customer centric, whether it's pushing decision-making down, whether it's changing what defines the leader, any of these things, creating processes that specifically enable and ensure that, making your metrics be more customer-centric. You've got to, no team is ever defined with a set of metrics at Amazon where customer metrics, not financial metrics, but what is the customer experience? Are we building trust in the brand? Are one of the key metrics that you cannot escape. So it's putting it in the process. And the other side of it, in addition to process, and this speaks also to what Juliana said about sort of people embracing this, is you do at scale also need to tell the story. You need to imbue this change with meaning, and that's where stories and symbolic action happen. That's where the stories that leaders tell about the company, spotlighting people who are doing the right thing, finding that little team in EMA and trumpeting their story across the organization to people who never even heard of that brand. Absolutely critical. Stories of where you felt you fell short, really impactful. Telling that story over and over again, that one little thing that didn't sink the company, but guess what? It really didn't uphold this value we're pushing for. And we don't want to ever make that mistake again, even if no one notices but us. That kind of storytelling, symbolic action. My friend Espen Hansen, who's was the CEO of two different media companies in the Schibsted group in Scandinavia through huge organizational cultural changes. He talked about coming in the first day as the head of what was the New York Times of Norway. Every morning for 150 years, the company had started, the newspaper started the day with the top brass of the paper meeting together and going over what went well and what didn't, what were the best things and not best things from the day's paper the day before. And he went once as the new CEO. The first day he sat, he just listened and he nodded. At the end of the meeting with all the top people, he said, "This was very nice. Tomorrow, I think we'll do something different." And he killed the meeting after 150 years. And the next day, the morning meeting was with everybody in the company, right? The technologists, the advertising team, the publishers, the editors, the reporters, the janitors were invited. Everyone was there for that review of, okay, what did we learn? What can we learn from yesterday?
Great.
And as Espen told me, it was about the symbolism of saying, Everybody's voice matters. This is about data. This is about getting close to the customer. It's not about a few people at the top making the decisions. And that was mostly symbolism, but it's a very powerful symbol. And that's really the last piece you got to have.
That's great. And that's a great last word. As everybody can check their chat string, I've just sent a link to the complimentary chapter from the Digital Transformation Playbook. So that'll stay up as long as we're on here, and we'll send that along as well. We're a little over time, so I'm just going to have to quickly wrap it up and say thanks to all of you. I'd love to do this again. We could have gone another hour. Really,
thanks, Drew. If anybody doesn't catch the link, it's also on my website, David Rogers, or digitaltransformationplaybook.com. And you can find the chapter there. Just because I know.
Matt, I know you're still out there in audio. Thank you as well. Let's do this again. Is all I can say. Juliana, thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Juliana, thank you, Drew.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Professor Dave.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Josh.
Thank you.